Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric series on the MiSTer FPGA DE10 Nano project, more specifically in the Nintendo 64 core, because we're back with our next head-to-head comparison, NSO Online versus the FPGA core in and of itself. And I let you guys request what game you wanted to see next, and I heard a lot of Sin and Punishment. Because it is one of my favorite games on the Nintendo 64, I figured we'd compare the FPGA core's performance to NSO on Nintendo Switch. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, down below, hit like and subscribe and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, got a Patreon link down below as well. And be aware that NSO does have these overlays, but for the rest of the video I'm going to be removing them, so it's going to look like this, just because I don't want to have all those dots on the screen the entire time. And it's one of those things I totally understand why they have an overlay, it just isn't for me. And if you've never somehow played Sin and Punishment before, I can't recommend this game enough. It's absolutely a classic, and one that I feel like a ton of people haven't played, and you'll easily be able to tell what source we're looking at because NSO has all of the internal rendering resolution scaling going on here, giving you a cleaner image and a little bit better texture work as far as the image is concerned. But if we move over to MiSTer FPGA, this is how the game would have been initially presented, and honestly in this comparison at least, I prefer the original look more than I do the actual upscaled version on NSO. Now that is going to be subjective, neither one is quote unquote right. Obviously the source material on Nintendo 64 would be the developers and artists' original intent, so you could probably say that one is more quote-unquote correct, but this is a subjective situation in which whatever you prefer look-wise is going to be the right answer for you. There's just something about the slight blurriness in Sin and Punishment, especially in this first level here, that kind of adds more atmosphere and a little bit more depth in the image. As these bugs go into the background, they don't have the same shading as you see on something like Nintendo 64, so for me at least, that's something that I do appreciate about the original image, and something that I do feel is lost on the NSO implementation. But I totally get it's up to you to decide which one you like looks better, so do leave me a comment down below. But watch these bugs recede into the background. It does look more like they're going into a foggy cloud layer and being obscured by that mist than it does just seem to have their shading changing ever so slightly in the NSO version. The good thing is though, performance-wise, both of these games seem to hang relatively well. There's some games on NSO that definitely have frame hitching like F-Zero, and we'll be talking about that soon unless I've already showed it to you. But as far as the performance in Sin and Punishment, you get a great experience across both the core and the NSO version as well. So there's not really anything I can point to performance-wise that says you'd want to use one over the other, and that's always a nice thing because NSO, Nintendo 64 emulation, has been a bit notorious for being a little bit problematic and difficult to deal with in certain games. But that's the interesting thing about software emulation, is that some games will have a few issues where other games will run flawlessly, and that's just down to the implementation. And I'm almost wondering if Nintendo's banking on the fact that not many people are going to remember how these games specifically run, and if it wasn't for the Nintendo 64 FPGA core's development, a lot of us wouldn't have played some of these games since they came out. So the reality is, this is fresh in a lot of people's minds, so it is easier to compare the two side by side. And speaking of side by sides, let's do the introductory sequence here. You'll see that we have NSO on the left and the core on the right. I don't need to demarcate these because you can absolutely tell a difference in the overall image quality. And this is a situation in which the softer image is definitely more pleasing to my eye because the textures are still going to be blurry. They're not really doing much on the texture side of things. You get a little bit more clarity, but the original textures are still the original textures. So sometimes they're going to look a little bit worse when they actually are in a higher resolution. And there's something again about the softness of the building here. Almost looks like they're having a pseudo depth of field effect on Nintendo 64. It is just down to the blur on the textures, but honestly on the right it is a much more cinematic feel, and you'll see here the sky color is completely different across both sources as well, and I do think the Nintendo 64, the original implementation, is more pleasing to the eye. But we spent enough time talking about the visuals. We're going to get into the gameplay in a moment, but go ahead and have a sound sample, first NSO and then the FPGA core. Really listen to the overall audio quality, the music and sound effects, and then leave me a comment after the fact and tell me which one you think sounds better. So let's listen in.
Watch out behind us! Nice shot! Keep it up!
Both sound good to my ear. I'd say the NSO version sounds a little bit cleaner, where the MiSTer FPGA version sounds a little bit more authentic, but again, I am not an audiophile. I am purely a visual person. When I'm on a film set, the audio department is there for a reason. I let them do their work because they know everything and I know nothing when it comes to audio. Just isn't my specialty. But leave me a comment down below and you tell me again what you think of the sound and which one you prefer. But as another side-by-side comparison here, the softness in the image on the Nintendo 64 core really is what I'm finding to be a more pleasurable experience as far as actually looking at the game. You can see that on the right, the overall image has a lot better depth and separation. That building in the background, the skybox being so soft compared to what you see in front of you, really does look like a different camera aperture and giving you that depth of field effect. That is something that is being lost visually on the NSO implementation, and I think that's something that really is important to the overall sin and punishment vibe. But if we talk about the gameplay, there is another situation in which there really isn't much of a fundamental difference. You might get a few more frames here and there, and if we move over to something like the NSO version here, you can see everything is running at a great frame rate, and you will get some frame rate improvements on NSO, but honestly, Sin and Punishment runs totally fine on the Nintendo 64, whether it's real hardware or the stock FPGA core, and you can obviously put it on turbo as well, so that separation really isn't as meaningful as I'd like it to be. And you'll see here as the ship comes over on the bridge, everything looks good. It's a little bit clearer, but again, that building in the background is so sharp, where here on the Nintendo 64 core, that building is a lot softer, and it really does focus you on where the combat is taking place versus the entire overall depth of the image. And I know maybe people aren't going to care about that as much as I do, but it is something that I notice, and I really do feel like on the Nintendo 64 core, you really get drawn into the combat, and you better understand where you should be looking based upon that depth and the blurriness in the background. And you'll see here as the ship comes in, it's probably running about like maybe 30 frames per second. I don't have the frame counter on because I don't really want to focus on the frame rate. I focus on the feel. It's certainly enough frames to 100% appreciate what's going on and be able to play. Now we have that same sequence here, and you will see we got the same stutter in about the same area, and everything seems to be animating and running at about the same frame rate. So there's certain instances, NSO versus the FPGA core, where you're going to see the same performance hiccups, and that is because whether you're using software emulation or whether you're using an FPGA implementation, areas in which the original hardware would struggle can and will struggle on software emulation as well. That is just how it works, and honestly that would be a more accurate experience because it is closer adhering to the performance of the original console. And I'll say here, all of the effects, the smoke, all of those particles look great on NSO. That is an area in which I think it actually does look ever so slightly better. Let's do another side-by-side comparison in a locked-off manner here. This central commander bonus is going to go away at the exact same frame, and everything else is going to be out of my control until we get back into the game. So we're seeing which cutscene is going to lock to the other one, and you'll see here, at least on the NSO loading, that screen transition is slightly faster. Now, I've looked at original hardware on this, and I will say that the MiSTer FPGA source is the accurate one. It came up on the same frame as it did with my EverDrive 64, so it seems like NSO is getting ever so slightly ahead of itself, maybe by like 2 to 3 frames, because it is a cutscene that isn't fundamentally going to affect your enjoyment of playing the game. You would never know that there was a 3-frame speed up on NSO if I didn't tell you about it in a video, because honestly, those results are mathematically interesting, but from an enjoyment perspective are absolutely irrelevant. It's just something we use to check accuracy. It doesn't affect your fun whatsoever. And these are always the most interesting comparisons to me because I actually get to hear what you guys like subjectively as far as the overall image is concerned. Because if I can say the gameplay is identical side by side, if I can say the same amount of fun is there side by side, then that only leaves us with the visual differences as far as the enhancements on NSO and the original look on the Nintendo 64 core. So I do get to find out what you guys are vibing on, for lack of a better term. And again, for me in this scene here, I do prefer the FPGA core. I'm not saying that the FPGA core is better than NSO implementation. I'm just saying that as a personal preference. But there's going to be games in this testing series where you're going to see that NSO definitely is not the way to play, and that really is the main takeaway. So after Emulation versus FPGA core on Nintendo 64, at least on the NSO side, is going to be game by game dependent. Some games like Sin and Punishment are going to look great here on the FPGA core, and they're also going to look great on NSO. Other games are going to have some lag, some control issues, some frame pacing on NSO that are definitely going to make them not recommends. So it's not like you can try to use the entirety of the Nintendo 64 library on NSO and get the same experience, nor is it even possible based on distribution. There's only so many games up there where the FPGA core obviously is going to run the entirety of the retail library, as well as some fan games as well. Not all will work, but a lot of them do. And again, it's just one of those experiences. No matter which way you play Sin and Punishment, if you've never played it before, you absolutely have to do that for me. If you have NSO, it's a great way to play. Would I buy a MiSTer FPGA just to play this game? I definitely wouldn't recommend that, but of course I'd recommend you buy a MiSTer FPGA because there's a metric ton of fun to be had. But honestly, Sin and Punishment is just one of those titles. It feels so unique. It feels so treasured. The developers, they just have their DNA all over this. And it's one of the most interesting games as far as Nintendo 64 is concerned. And it is a title that I feel like more people need to play. So you can tell me down below, have you played Sin and Punishment? And if so, where did you first play it? For me, obviously, I had an import copy on Nintendo 64, which I still have in my collection. But from now on, if I want to play this game, the default is going to be MiSTer FPGA for me. But if you want to see more of these comparisons, leave me some title recommendations down below, because more often than not, I do read the comments, and I compile how many requests I get for a specific game, and more often than not, that game will be the next comparison you see. But again, if you've never played Sin and Punishment before, you're missing out. Doesn't matter how you play it, it's a 10 out of 10 game on every single platform. But short of that, we're done, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.